we drift into the quiet corners of ancient Greece, into stories that were whispered by firelight long before they were ever written down. These are not the myths you learned in school, not the loud battles of Troy, or the 12 labors carved into marble. Tonight, we wander somewhere softer, into groves and riverbanks, and starlit thresholds, where God still walked quietly among mortals, and where love, grief, and wonder shaped the world as much as any thunderbolt ever did. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these slow old stories, consider leaving a like. And if you're the kind of listener who enjoys myth as a lullaby, subscribe so more of these tales find their way to you. And if you like, tell us where you're listening from tonight and what hour it is where you are. Some of you are watching under a rising moon, others just before dawn. Wherever you are, let the world outside grow quiet. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let a fan hum or the rain fall outside your window. Settle in, because tonight we return to the beginning of things, to a time when the veil between gods and mortals was thin enough to touch. In the hill country north of the Gulf of Corinth, where olive trees grew crooked from centuries of wind, there was a village called Ono, so small it did not appear on any map a king would trouble himself with. The people there lived by the turning of seasons, by the flowering of almond trees in late winter, and the slow gold of the barley in summer. They were not warriors. They were not priests of any great temple. They were shepherds and weavers and keepers of bees, and among them lived a girl named Thelxinoe, though her mother called her simply Thelxie, which meant, in the old tongue, the one who soothes. She was given that name because from the moment she could speak, her voice carried something unusual in it, a calm that settled over rooms like dust after rain. When infants cried, mothers would bring them to Thelxie, and within moments, the crying would soften into sleep. When old men groaned through fevers, she would sit beside their beds and hum low, wordless tunes, and their breathing would even out, their faces would loosen. No one taught her this. It simply lived in her, the way some children are born already knowing how to swim, or how to read the coming weather in the shape of clouds. Her mother, Calira, was the village's midwife, and it was Calira who first noticed something odd about her daughter's gift. It was not only that Thelxie's voice calmed the sick, it was that flowers seemed to lean toward her when she sang. Bees, which normally scattered when children ran past their hives, would circle her shoulders and land gently on her wrists, as though listening. Once, during a summer drought so severe that the well ran to mud, Thelxie sat at its edge and sang softly to herself out of boredom. And by evening, without a cloud in the sky, water had crept back up the stones. The villagers began to whisper, as villagers always do. Some said she was blessed. Others, in the way fear often disguises itself as caution, said she was marked, and that no good ever came from a child too strange for her own home. Calira paid the whispers no mind. She raised her daughter the way she would have raised any child, teaching her to spin wool, to recognize which herbs eased a stomach ache, and which could stop a heart, to greet elders with respect, and to fear the sea in autumn. But she also noticed, quietly, that on certain nights, when the moon was full and heavy over the hills, Thelxie would wander from their small home and not return until just before sunrise. At first, Calira followed her, worried, the way any mother would be. She found her daughter sitting alone in a clearing not far from the village, beside a spring that the old people called sacred, though no one quite remembered why. Thelxie would sit at its edge in silence, simply listening, her head tilted as though someone unseen were speaking to her. When Calira asked what she heard there, Thelxie only said, "The water remembers things. If you're patient, it tells you." Calira did not understand this answer, but she recognized something in her daughter's stillness that she had seen only once before, many years earlier, in the eyes of a woman from a neighboring village who had, according to old rumor, once been visited by a river god in her youth and never been quite the same afterward. Calira said nothing of this to Thelxie. Some fears, she believed, were better carried alone than passed on to a child. Thelxie grew, as children do, through the slow accumulation of ordinary days, tending goats, learning to weave patterns of birds and vines into cloth, watching her mother deliver the village's infants into the world. But the nights at the spring continued, and as she grew older, so did what she heard there. It began as fragments, rhythms without words, the kind of half-formed music one hears in dreams and forgets by morning. But over the years, it became clearer, until by the time she was 17, she understood that what she heard was not water at all. It was a voice, low and layered, speaking not in the language of men, but in something older, something that seemed to arrive less through her ears and more through the bones of her chest. And one night, beneath a moon so full it seemed to press down on the hills like a held breath, the voice finally spoke words she could understand. "Thelxinoe," it said, and her name in that voice did not sound like her name at all, but like something ancient, something borrowed. "You have listened long enough. Now it is time you learned who is listening back." The spring, where Thelxie sat night after night, had a history far older than the village of Ono itself, older even than the hill country's oldest families could trace. Long before shepherds settled those slopes, before olive groves were planted in careful rows, the spring had belonged to a Naiad, one of the countless water spirits who tended the rivers, streams, and springs of the Greek countryside. Unseen by most mortals, indifferent to most of their concerns. Her name was Argyra, and unlike the great gods of Olympus, who ruled kingdoms and commanded storms, Argyra's whole existence was bound to that single spring, to its clarity, its temperature, the moss that grew along its stones. For centuries, she had watched mortals come and go along the hillside, watched villages rise and fall, watched wars pass in the distance, like weather she had no part in. She had grown used to solitude. Water spirits, unlike river gods or sea gods, were rarely worshipped with any real devotion. People left offerings out of habit more than belief, tossed in a coin or a flower, and moved on. Argyra had long stopped expecting anything more than that, but there was something different about the girl who began coming to her spring as a small child, humming to herself, unafraid of the dark. Argyra noticed it the way one notices a change in temperature, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The girl's presence did not disturb the water the way most mortals did. If anything, the spring seemed to still further when she arrived, as though recognizing kinship. For years, Argyra only watched. Naiads were cautious creatures, having learned across centuries that mortal affection was fleeting, that villages moved, that children grew old and died, while spirits remained fixed to their waters, forever tied to a single patch of earth. But loneliness, even for the divine, is not so easily resisted, and slowly, the Naiad began to let fragments of herself drift into the water where Thelxinoe sat, small murmurs, echoes of old songs sung by long-dead worshippers, half-remembered stories from centuries past. It was, in its way, a kind of friendship, offered so gradually that neither of them could say exactly when it had begun. When Argyra finally spoke Thelxinoe's name aloud that night beneath the heavy moon, it was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of years of quiet trust, the moment when solitude finally gave way to something neither of them had words for. "I have listened to you since before I understood what listening meant," Thelxinoe answered, unafraid, though her heart pounded strangely in her chest. "I thought I was imagining you." "Many mortals do," Argyra said, and there was something almost like amusement in her voice, worn smooth by centuries. "It is easier for you to believe you're imagining the world than to believe the world is stranger than you were taught." Thelxinoe asked her then, the question that had gathered in her for years, without ever finding its shape. "Why me? Why have you spoken to no one else in all this time?" The water stirred faintly, though there was no wind. "Because you listen without wanting anything back," Argyra said. "Most mortals come to springs to ask for things: health, love, fortune. You came only to sit. That is a rarer gift than you understand." That night forward, their conversations deepened. Argyra taught her the old names of the hills, the true reasons certain trees were planted where they stood, stories of gods who had passed through those valleys long before any mortal memory could recall. Thelxinoe, in turn, told the Naiad about her days, about her mother's work, about the small griefs and joys of a life fully lived among mortals. Seasons Argyra herself would never know firsthand. It became, in its own quiet way, the truest friendship either of them had ever known, one built not on grand gestures, but on patience, on simply showing up, night after night, willing to listen. But friendships between mortals and the divine, however gentle, however untouched by desire or ambition, rarely go unnoticed by the wider world of gods. And in the valleys beyond Ono, where rivers ran deeper and older powers stirred, word travels strangely, carried not on wind or written page, but on the subtle vibration that ripples through all connected waters when something changes. The river that ran through the valley beyond Unna was called the Cruthas by the people who lived along its banks, though it had older names still, names spoken only by the very old or the very devout. It was wider and deeper than Argyra's modest spring, fed by mountain snow, and cutting a slow, patient path toward the sea, and it belonged, as all great rivers did, to a god rather than a lesser spirit. His name was Crutpun, and unlike Udjara, who had lived centuries in gentle obscurity, Crutpun was worshipped properly, with shrines along his banks and offerings of wine poured into his current at every harvest. River gods, in the old stories, were a strange and often overlooked category of the divine. They were not Olympians, not counted among the 12 who sat in judgment over gods and mortals alike, but they were older in some ways, tied to the land itself, present since the rivers first carved their paths through stone. They were proud in the particular way that comes from being both powerful and perpetually underappreciated. Gods who commanded real strength, capable of flooding fields or receding into drought at will, and yet were treated by the greater Olympians as little more than local caretakers, minor functionaries of the natural world. Crutpun had known Udjara for longer than either of them could easily measure, not as a friend exactly, but as a fellow spirit of the same wild country, the way two trees standing near each other for centuries come to know each other's shapes without ever exchanging words. He had watched her spring for generations, watched villages rise around it, watched countless mortal lives pass like ripples across her surface. He had also noticed, the way old spirits notice such things, that something had changed in her these last several years. It was not obvious at first. Rivers and springs communicate in ways mortals rarely perceive. Subtle shifts in current, in temperature, in the particular quality of stillness a body of water holds. But Crutpun, ancient and watchful, felt it clearly enough. Udjara's spring had grown warmer, somehow more alive, humming faintly with an energy that had not been there in the quiet centuries before. And when he traced the source of that change, as rivers eventually trace all things back to their beginning, he found a mortal girl. At first, this discovery amused him more than it troubled him. Naiads were known for their occasional fondness for mortals, brief, harmless attachments that rarely lasted longer than a single human lifetime before fatting back into the eternal patience of water. He assumed Udjara's friendship with the girl from Unna was simply another such fondness, a passing warmth that would cool in time, as all mortal things eventually did. But seasons passed, and the warmth did not fade. If anything, it deepened, until Crutpun could feel, even from the distance of his own riverbed miles away, the particular resonance of two voices speaking together in the dark, a mortal girl's and a naiad's, woven so closely that the river itself seemed to catch the rhythm of it in its current. This was not a passing fondness. This was something rarer, something that unsettled him in a way he did not immediately understand. It was not jealousy, not exactly, though there was a thread of that too, a discomfort at watching another spirit's isolation dissolve while his own remained. Crutpun had ruled his river for longer than memory could hold, worshipped, respected, feared when the floods came, but never truly known, not not in the way Udjara now seemed to be known by this mortal girl. What troubled him more, though, was older and colder than envy. It was the memory of what happened. In the old stories, his own kind still told each other in the deep hours before dawn. Whenever the divine grew too fond of mortals, the stories were not kind. A god who loved a mortal too deeply, the old warning said, eventually lost themselves to it, forgot their nature, forgot the boundaries the gods maintained. And when Olympus noticed such attachments, as Olympus inevitably did, the consequences rarely fell only upon the mortal. The god, too, paid a price, sometimes exile, sometimes transformation, sometimes something kralk still. Krutpun had seen it happen before, centuries ago, to a wood nymph who had grown too close to a young shepherd, and the memory of what became of her, sealed within the bark of a tree that still stood somewhere in the eastern hills, had never fully left him. He told himself he was protecting Udjara by watching more closely. He told himself this was simply prudence, the kind of vigilance any elder spirit owed a younger one navigating dangerous waters, so to speak. But beneath that reasoning, quieter and less examined, was something closer to fear. A fear that if Udjara's bond with the mortal girl was allowed to deepen further, it would draw attention neither of them could survive. So Krutpun began to watch the spring more directly. He sent small currents of himself, thin tributaries that fed unnoticed into Udjara's waters, carrying pieces of his awareness into her domain, the way a worried neighbor might listen at a shared wall. What he found, on the nights he watched, only confirmed his unease. He saw Thelxinoe sitting at the spring's edge, saw the particular stillness of her posture, the way she leaned toward the water as though it were a person she trusted completely. He heard, faintly, fragments of the conversations passing between them, not the words exactly. Rivers could rarely parse mortal speech with total clarity, but the emotional shape of them, warmth, curiosity, an ease that had clearly been built over years rather than months. And he saw something else, something that troubled him more than the friendship itself. He saw that the girl was not merely fond of Udjara. She had, without seeming to fully realize it herself, begun to change the way she moved through her own mortal life because of it. She spoke less to the other villagers. She wandered from her chores earlier each evening, drawn toward the spring before the sun had even fully set. She had begun, in small, unconscious ways, to live half in the mortal world and half somewhere else entirely. A threshold space that belonged fully to neither. Krutpun had seen this pattern before as well, in other mortals who grew too close to the divine. It rarely ended in the mortal's favor, whether it was noticed by the greater gods or not, whether punishment ever came from Olympus, or simply from the slow erosion of a life lived too far from other mortals. The outcome tended to be the same. The mortal drifted further and further from their own kind, until eventually they belonged nowhere at all, neither fully human nor fully divine, suspended in a loneliness far deeper than the one the friendship had first tried to ease. He decided after much deliberation, that he could not simply watch this unfold in silence. Whatever discomfort he felt about interfering in another spirit's affairs, he felt a stronger obligation, born of centuries of shared existence along that hillside, to prevent Argyra from repeating the mistake he had watched destroy others like her. And so, on a night when the moon had waned to a thin curve, and the spring ran low and quiet, Creation sent a larger portion of himself up through the earth beneath Argyra's waters, enough that his presence could no longer be mistaken for a passing current, enough that both the Naiad and the girl beside her felt the ground itself seem to shift. Thelxie startled, pulling back from the water's edge, though she could not have said exactly what had frightened her. Argyra, however, recognized the presence immediately, and something in her posture, if water could be said to have posture, grew suddenly guarded. "Creation," she said, her voice carrying an edge Thelxie had never heard in it before. "You have never entered my spring uninvited." "I have never needed to before," the river god answered, his voice arriving not through the air, but through the ground itself, a low vibration that Thelxie felt more than heard, deep in her chest and the soles of her feet. "You have grown careless, old friend. Do you understand what you are risking?" "I understand precisely what I am doing," Argyra said, and though her voice remained calm, there was a firmness in it that surprised even her. "I have done nothing that violates the old boundaries. I have offered her nothing but companionship." "Companionship is how it always begins," Creation said. "I have seen this story before, Argyra. I watched it happen to Oria, and I watched what became of her when the boundaries were crossed too far, when a mortal grew too entangled with what does not belong to their world. You remember what happened to her." A silence fell over the spring, heavy enough that even Thelxie, who could not follow every word of the exchange, felt its weight pressing against her chest. She understood, in the way one understands the emotional temperature of a room, even without grasping every word spoken in it, that something had shifted, that a threat had entered a space she had always considered safe. "I am not Oria," Argyra finally said, quieter now, "and she is not like the mortal who destroyed her. Thelxie has asked nothing of me. She has taken nothing. She has only listened, the way I have listened to her." "Now," Creation said, "but listening is rarely where these things end, and you know it. Attachment deepens. Need grows on both sides, whether either of you intends it or not. And when the greater gods notice, and they will notice eventually, they do not distinguish between an innocent friendship and a dangerous one. They see only that a boundary has been blurred, and boundaries blurred are boundaries punished." Thelxie, unable to bear the tension of a conversation she could only half understand, finally spoke aloud into the dark. "If there is danger in this, it is mine to carry, not yours to decide for us. I came to this spring on my own. No one forced me here." There was a pause, long enough that Thelxie wondered if the river god had heard her at all. When he finally spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, though not with kindness exactly, more with the weariness of something very old speaking to something very young. "You do not yet understand what you are asking to carry, child," Creation said. Mortal lives are short, and mortal grief is sharp, but brief, because it must end when your own life ends. But the divine do not forget the way you forget. If this bond deepens further and is later severed, whether by the will of Olympus or by the simple, unavoidable fact of your mortality, Argyra will carry that loss for centuries after your name has been forgotten, even by your own descendants. Is that a burden you are prepared to hand to someone who will outlive your grief 1,000 times over? The question landed with a weight Thelxie had not anticipated, and for the first time since she had begun visiting the spring as a small child, she found herself uncertain, caught between the comfort she had always found in Argyra's presence and a fear she had never before considered, not fear for herself, but fear of what her own mortality might eventually cost someone she loved. Argyra, sensing the girl's hesitation, spoke gently into the silence that followed. Creation speaks from old wounds, not from cruelty, she said. He is not wrong that there is risk in what we have built, but he is also not the one who must decide what risks are worth taking. That choice belongs to us, not to him, however much history he carries. I am trying to protect you, Creation said, and for the first time, something almost like tenderness cracked through his otherwise stern current. I have watched too many of us fall into this pattern and lose ourselves entirely to grief that has no end. I would rather see you cautious and whole than devoted and eventually shattered. I would rather risk grief with open eyes than live centuries more in the kind of hollow safety you are describing, Argyra answered. You call it protection. I have come to understand, over these last years, that it might simply be another word for loneliness dressed up as wisdom. The words seemed to strike something in the old river god, a silence following that felt different from the tension before, more contemplative than combative. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. Perhaps you are right that the choice is not mine to make, he said slowly. But I will not simply stand aside and watch this unfold without warning you both properly of what may come. There are eyes on the hill country that neither of you can see, old eyes that notice when the natural order shifts, even slightly. If this bond continues to grow as it has, it will be noticed eventually, whether by Hermes, who carries word of such things swiftly to Olympus, or by the fates themselves, who track every thread that grows too tightly wound between mortal and divine. I only ask that you understand the risk clearly, rather than discovering it only when it is too late to prepare for it. With that, the presence of the river god withdrew, the ground beneath the spring settling back into its familiar stillness, though something in the air remained changed, a kind of quiet unease that lingered even after Creation's current had fully retreated back toward his own distant banks. Thelxie sat in silence for a long while afterward, staring into the dark water, turning the river god's warning over in her mind, the way one turns a stone to examine every unfamiliar edge. Is it true? She finally asked. What he said about the fates, about being noticed. Argyra was quiet for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried an honesty that Thelxie had not always heard from her before. the honesty of someone choosing not to soften a difficult truth for comfort's sake. It is true that the fates notice threads that grow unusual, she said. Most mortal lives pass through their weaving quickly, ordinary threads among countless others, easily accounted for. But a mortal life entangled with the divine grows a different texture, one that catches their attention more readily. I cannot promise you they have not already noticed us. If they have, Thelxie asked, what happens then? I do not know, Argyra admitted. The fates do not explain themselves, even to other divine beings. Sometimes they simply observe, content to let a thread unfold as it will, curious to see where it leads. Other times, if they judge a thread to be pulling too much weight away from the pattern they intend, they act to correct it, and their corrections are rarely gentle. Thelxie absorbed this in silence, the cool night air settling around her shoulders like a weight she had not felt before that evening. And yet, when she finally spoke again, there was no fear in her voice, only a quiet resolve that surprised even her. Then let them notice, she said. I would rather live a shorter thread woven honestly than a longer one spent pretending I never found you at all. Argyra did not answer immediately, and when she finally did, her voice carried something that, in a being as old and as measured as a Naiad, was rare enough to feel almost startling, something close to wonder. You say that so easily, she said, as though you do not yet understand what it might cost you. Maybe I don't, Thelxie admitted. But I have watched my mother deliver children into a world that offers no guarantees to any of them, healthy or sick, wanted or unwanted. I have watched the drought take our well, and the winter take our elders, and I have learned that safety was never something any of us truly had, mortal or otherwise. If loving carefully and loving carelessly both end in loss eventually, I would rather choose the kind of loss that came from something real. Two of them sat together in silence after that, the spring's surface catching fragments of moonlight, undisturbed by wind. Whatever unease Creation's warning had planted between them slowly settled into something quieter, not resolved exactly, but accepted, the way mortals and immortals alike eventually learn to carry uncertainty simply by continuing to live alongside it. But warnings, once spoken aloud, rarely disappear entirely. They tend to linger, the way smoke lingers in a room long after the fire itself has been put out. And in the weeks that followed, both Thelxie and Argyra found themselves more aware, more careful, more conscious of a presence they could not see, but could no longer fully ignore. Somewhere in the vast, indifferent weaving of fate that stretched far beyond the quiet hills of Ono, for a time, life along the hillside continued much as it always had. Thelxie returned to her days, tending goats, helping her mother with the village's sick, and expecting mothers, weaving in the evenings by firelight. But something in her had shifted since the night of Creation's warning, a new awareness of her own mortality that had not troubled her so directly before. She began to notice, in small ways she had never paid attention to previously, how quickly the seasons turned, how the elders of the village seemed to age visibly within a single winter, how even the strongest among them eventually grew frail and were laid to rest beneath the same hillside stones that had witnessed their entire lives. She did not stop visiting the spring. If anything, she found herself drawn there more often, as though some instinct in her understood that time, whatever shape it might take for a mortal life, was more precious than she had once assumed. Kalira noticed the change in her daughter too, though she could not have said precisely what had caused it. Thelxie had always been thoughtful, but now there was a new gravity to her, a way of looking at ordinary things, a sunset, a newborn child's first cry, a field of ripening barley, as though she were trying to memorize them, to hold on to them a little more tightly than before. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the hill country, and the almond trees prepared to shed the last of their leaves, Kalira finally asked her daughter directly what had changed. They sat together by the hearth, spinning wool in companionable silence, the way they had for years. But the silence that evening felt different, weighted with something Thelxie had not yet found the words to share. "Grown quieter this season," Kalira said, not looking up from her spinning. "Quieter and somehow older, though you're barely past girlhood. Tell me what troubles you." Thelxie hesitated. She had never told her mother directly about Argyra, though she suspected, from certain glances over the years, that Kalira had guessed at least part of the truth long ago. But something in her mother's steady, unhurried patience that evening made her feel, for the first time, that the truth might finally be safe to share. "Have a friend," she said slowly, choosing her words with the same care she might use to handle something fragile. "Someone I've known for years now, someone who isn't like anyone else in the village." Kalira's hands stilled on the spindle, though she still did not look up. "The spring," she said quietly. It was not quite a question. Thelxie's breath caught. "You knew, I suspected," Kalira said. "I followed you there once, many years ago, when you were still small enough that I worried for your safety wandering alone at night. I saw you sitting at the water's edge, listening to something I couldn't hear. I never told you, because I didn't know what to make of it, and because some part of me feared that speaking of it aloud might frighten it away, whatever it was, and take something precious from you that I didn't fully understand." Thelxie felt tears rise unexpectedly, grateful in a way she had not anticipated for a secret carried, gently rather than forced, into the open. "Her name is Argyra," she said. "She's the spirit of the spring. She has been my friend since before I can remember properly choosing anyone as a friend." Kalira was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular caution of a mother who had spent a lifetime delivering both life and death into the world, who understood, better than most, how thin the line between blessing and danger could sometimes be. "And is this friendship a safe one?" she asked. "Or is it the kind the old stories warn us about?" Thelxie thought of Creation's warning, of the fates who might already be watching the shape of her life unfold. "I don't know if it's safe," she admitted honestly, "but I know it's real, and I know I wouldn't trade it away, even if I could." Kalira reached over and took her daughter's hand, the same steady hands that had guided countless infants into the world, now offering comfort instead. "Then I will not ask you to trade it away," she said. "I only ask that you be careful and that you remember, whatever happens with a friend who cannot die the way we do, that you still belong here too, among us, among the mortal world that raised you. Don't let the spring take all of you, even if it offers you something wonderful. Save some part of yourself for us as well." It was, in its way, the same warning Creation had given weeks earlier, though offered with none of the fear and all of the tenderness a mother could bring to such words. Thelxie promised, as sincerely as she knew how, to remember, though even as she spoke the promise, some quiet part of her already understood how difficult it might be to keep, once the threads of her life had grown so thoroughly entangled with something eternal. The winter that followed was harsher than most the village had known in recent memory. Snow settled deep into the hill country, and illness moved through Ono the way it often did in the coldest months, slipping from house to house on the same wind that rattled thin doors and stole warmth from hearths not carefully tended. Kalira worked tirelessly through those months, moving from home to home, treating fevers, delivering children born too early into a world that offered them little mercy in such conditions, burying those the winter claimed despite her best efforts. Thelxie helped where she could, though her gift, whatever its exact nature, seemed to hold little power over illness itself, only over the fear and restlessness that so often accompanied it. She sat with feverish children through long nights, humming the same low, wordless tunes that had calmed her own cries as an infant. And though her songs could not cure sickness, they seemed, more often than not, to ease the suffering of those too weak to fight it fully alone, and to soften, when it came to that, the passage of those the village could not save. It was during this difficult winter that Thelxie found herself visiting the spring less often, not out of any wanting affection for Argyra, but simply because the demands of mortal life, illness, grief, exhaustion, left her with fewer quiet hours to spare. When she did manage to slip away to the spring's edge, often near dawn, after a long night tending the sick, she found the water frozen at its surface in a way she had never seen before. A thin sheet of ice covering what had always run clear and unfrozen even through the coldest months. Concerned, she broke the ice carefully with a stone and called out into the stillness beneath. It took longer than usual for Argyra to respond, and when her voice finally emerged, it carried a weariness Thelxie had not heard from her before. "The winter has been hard on me as well," Argyra admitted, when Thelxie asked what was wrong. "Springs are not immune to the seasons the way you might imagine. When the ground freezes too deeply, my own strength grows thin, harder to gather, harder to hold together clearly enough to speak." Thelxie felt a fresh wave of guilt at how infrequently she had visited these past weeks, though Argyra was quick to reassure her that this was simply the natural order of things, not a fault to be carried. "You have mortal duties that matter more urgently than my company, Argyra said. Your village needs you now in ways I do not. I would rather you tend to the living than sit here keeping an old spirit company through a difficult season. Still, Thelxie made a point, after that conversation, to visit more often despite her exhaustion, even if only for a few quiet minutes at dawn, before the village's demands claimed her fully again. She found, in those brief visits, a kind of restoration she could not find elsewhere, a stillness that helped her carry the weight of everything she witnessed during that harsh winter. The illness, the grief, the small, exhausting miracles her mother worked night after night to keep as many alive as possible. It was during one of these dawn visits, in the deepest part of that difficult winter, that Thelxie noticed something unusual in the frost patterns along the spring's edge, delicate lines of ice that seemed, on closer inspection, to form shapes rather than the random patterns frost typically made. She knelt closer, brushing snow away from the stones, and found what appeared to be words, written not by any human hand, but etched somehow directly into the ice itself, in a script older than anything she had been taught to read. Argyra, she called softly, there's something written here in the ice. Do you know what it says? There was a long pause before the Naiad answered, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried an unfamiliar note of concern. Read it to me carefully, Argyra said. Trace each shape with your finger as you go, so I can feel it through the water. Thelxie did as she was asked, tracing the strange characters slowly, one by one, as Argyra listened through the connection between the girl's touch and the frozen surface beneath it. When she finished, the silence that followed stretched long enough that Thelxie grew genuinely afraid. It's the old script, Argyra finally said, her voice quieter than Thelxie had ever heard it, the kind used by the fates when they wish to mark a thread they are watching closely, so that any spirit connected to that thread understands they are no longer unseen. Thelxie's chest tightened. What does it say? Argyra hesitated once more before answering, and when the words finally came, they settled over the frozen spring like the first true frost of a long, uncertain winter still to come. It says a single word, she said. Noticed. The word lingered in the frozen air between them long after Thelxie had finished tracing its final letter. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, as though speaking might somehow deepen whatever attention had already been drawn toward them. Thelxie drew her hand back from the ice slowly, as if the frost itself might carry some lingering trace of whatever power had etched those letters into being, and pulled her cloak tighter against a cold that seemed, in that moment, to come from somewhere deeper than the winter air alone. What does it mean, exactly, she finally asked, to be noticed by them? Narration spoke of it as though it were something to fear, but he never explained what actually happens once the noticing begins. Argyra was quiet for a long moment, and Thelxie understood, even without being told directly, that the Naiad was choosing her words carefully, weighing how much truth a mortal girl on the edge of a hard winter could bear to hear before dawn fully broke over the hills. The fates do not act quickly, she finally said. They are not like Zeus, who strikes in anger, or Poseidon, who floods a coastline in a single furious night. Their work is slower, more patient, woven thread by thread across years, sometimes across entire lifetimes. To be noticed does not mean punishment has already begun. It means only that they have started watching more closely than before, that the thread of your life, and mine alongside it, has caught their attention in a way it did not before. What happens once they've watched long enough? Thelxie pressed. What do they do with a thread they've decided has grown too strange? That depends entirely on what they judge the thread to mean, Argyra said. Sometimes a thread that catches their notice is allowed to continue exactly as it was, if they judge it does no harm to the larger pattern they maintain. Other times, if they judge a thread to be pulling too much weight away from where it belongs, tangling itself too tightly with threads that were never meant to touch, they intervene, and their interventions can take many forms, sometimes gentle, sometimes not. Thelxie absorbed this in silence, watching her breath fog in the cold morning air. And you don't know which kind of thread we are to them, she said, not quite a question. No, Argyra admitted. I have lived many centuries, and even I do not fully understand the logic the fates use to judge such things. I only know that the word etched into my ice was a warning, not yet a punishment, and that warnings, when heeded properly, sometimes prevent the harsher consequences that follow when they are ignored. Then, what should we do? Thelxie asked. Heed it how? Argyra considered this for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, there was something almost apologetic in her voice, as though she regretted the practicality of what she was about to suggest. Perhaps, she said slowly, we should simply be more careful, visit less openly, speak more quietly, not end what we have built. I could not ask that of either of us now, but soften it enough that the thread grows less conspicuous, less likely to demand further attention. Thelxie felt something tighten in her chest at the suggestion, though she understood the wisdom in it even as it saddened her. You mean hide, she said quietly. I mean survive, Argyra corrected gently. There is no shame in surviving carefully, Thelxie. Even gods learn, eventually, that boldness has its limits. They agreed, that morning, to be more careful, though neither of them fully understood yet what careful would come to mean in the months that followed, nor how difficult it would prove to maintain a friendship that had, by its very nature, always thrived on openness and trust rather than concealment. Winter eventually loosened its grip on the hill country, as winters always eventually do, however endless they feel in their coldest weeks. The snow retreated first from the lower slopes, then slowly climbed back up toward the higher hills, revealing dark, wet earth eager for planting. Almond trees blossomed early that year, their pale flowers appearing almost overnight along branches that had stood bare and frozen for months. And the village of Ono, worn thin by a difficult winter, began the slow work of recovery that spring always demanded, replanting fields, rebuilding what storms had damaged, mourning properly, with full rites and offerings, those the season had claimed. Kalira, exhausted from months of tireless work, finally allowed herself brief moments of rest that spring. Moments Thelxie cherished all the more for how rare they had become. Mother and daughter spent quiet afternoons together in the emerging warmth, mending winter's damage to their small home, tending a garden that had gone neglected during the harshest months. And slowly, gradually, the particular heaviness that had settled over the village during winter began to lift. Thelxie's visits to the spring continued, though exactly as she and Argyra had agreed. They grew quieter, less frequent, more carefully timed to avoid the notice of other villagers who might wonder at a girl slipping away so regularly into the hills. She learned to visit in the earliest hours before dawn, when the rest of the village still slept, and the risk of being seen was smallest. And though something in her mourned the freedom their friendship had once enjoyed, she understood, as Argyra had explained, that this caution was simply the price of continuing at all. It was during one of these careful, early morning visits, not long after the almond trees had finished their brief spring blooming, that Thelxie noticed a change in the spring itself, subtle at first, easy to dismiss as simply the natural shift of seasons. The water, always clear, seemed somehow brighter that morning, catching the pale early light in a way it hadn't before. And when she knelt at its edge and called softly for Argyra, the voice that answered carried an unfamiliar lightness, almost giddy, entirely unlike the Naiad's usual measured calm. "Something has happened," Thelxie said immediately, recognizing the shift. "You sound different this morning." Argyra laughed, a sound like water tumbling gently over smooth stones, and Thelxie realized she had rarely, if ever, heard the Naiad laugh so freely before. "I have news," Argyra said, "though I hardly know how to explain it properly, since I am still trying to understand it myself." "Me," Thelxie urged, settling more comfortably at the water's edge, grateful for any excuse to linger a little longer than their careful new arrangement usually allowed. "Demeter has passed through these hills," Argyra said, and even speaking the name of one of the great Olympian goddesses seemed to carry a weight that made Thelxie sit up straighter. "She travels this way each spring, tending to the fields as they wake from winter, though she rarely lingers long enough to speak with lesser spirits like myself. But yesterday, she paused at my spring, and we spoke briefly about the season, about the harvest to come, ordinary conversation between spirits who share responsibility for the same patch of earth." Thelxie prompted, sensing there was more to the story than Argyra had yet revealed, and in the course of our conversation, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had heard rumors traveling through certain divine circles, rumors of a Naiad in the hill country who had formed an unusually deep friendship with a mortal girl gifted with a voice that soothed the sick and calmed the restless. She asked if the rumors were true. Thelxie felt her stomach tighten with sudden alarm. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth," Argyra said simply. "I saw no wisdom in lying to a goddess who could likely see through any deception easily enough. And besides, I found, when the moment came, that I did not pretend particularly wish to hide what we have built. However carefully, we have tried to conceal it these past months. I told her about you, about our years of friendship, about the warning Creation gave, about the word etched into the ice this past winter. Thelxie's heart pounded, uncertain whether to feel afraid or hopeful. And how did she respond? Here, Argyra's voice shifted again, carrying something that sounded almost like wonder. She was not angry, the Naiad said. If anything, she seemed thoughtful, even sympathetic. She told me that she herself understood something of what it means to love a mortal deeply, having spent a season each year in mourning for her own daughter's time away in the underworld, and having, across the centuries, formed her own quiet attachments to certain mortal farmers and gardeners whose devotion to the earth reminded her of something precious in her own nature. She said that not every bond between mortal and divine ends in tragedy, that some, if tended with care and humility, can exist gently within the larger pattern of the world without disrupting it. Then she isn't going to report us to the fates. Or to Zeus? Thelxie asked, hope rising cautiously in her chest. She made no promises either way, Argyra admitted. The greater gods rarely make firm promises to lesser spirits like myself. But she did offer something I did not expect. She said that if our friendship continued to bring genuine good into the world, if your gift for soothing the sick and comforting the grieving remained something you offered freely rather than hoarded selfishly, she would be willing to speak favorably of us, should the matter ever come formally before Olympus. She said the gods, whatever their reputation for jealousy and punishment, are not entirely blind to genuine goodness when they encounter it, however rarely that goodness crosses their notice. Thelxie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, relief flooding through her chest so suddenly that tears rose unexpectedly to her eyes. Then perhaps we don't need to hide any longer, she said. Perhaps we could go back to how things were before Creation's warning, before the ice. But Argyra, ever cautious despite the hopeful news, gently tempered her enthusiasm. Demeter's goodwill is valuable, she said, but it is not a guarantee. She is one goddess among many, and her voice, however respected, does not speak for the whole of Olympus. I think it wisest that we continue, as we have these past months, careful, quiet, but no longer quite so afraid. Let us earn whatever protection her goodwill might offer, rather than assuming it shields us entirely. Thelxie agreed, though the fear that had settled over her since the frozen winter morning, when she first read the word etched into the ice, had loosened considerably, replaced by something closer to cautious hope. She returned to the village, that morning lighter than she had felt in months. And though she said nothing to her mother of the specific conversation with Demeter, Calliera noticed immediately the change in her daughter's bearing. The way worry seemed to have eased from her shoulders. The months that followed brought a kind of quiet stability to Thelxie's life that she had not known since Creation's warning had first disturbed the peace of her friendship with Argyra. She continued her work in the village, helping her mother, tending to the sick, using her gift to comfort those in pain or fear. and she continued her visits to the spring, still careful, still quieter than they had once been, but no longer weighted with the same dread that had colored their conversations through the winter. It was during this gentler season, as summer began to settle warmly over the hill country, that Thelxie's gift began to draw attention beyond the boundaries of her own small village for the first time in her life. A merchant traveling through Ono on his way to the coastal markets fell suddenly and severely ill during his stay. A fever so violent that Calira, despite her considerable skill, feared for his life through the worst of it. Thelxie sat with him through 3 long nights, humming the same low, wordless tunes that had always calmed the suffering. And though she could not say for certain whether her gift alone saved him or whether her mother's careful treatment deserved the credit, the merchant recovered fully by the 4th morning, weak but alive and profoundly grateful. Before he continued on his journey to the coast, he sought Thelxie out to offer his thanks properly, pressing a small pouch of coins into her hands despite her protests that she wanted no payment for what she considered simply an act of kindness. "You misunderstand me, child," he said, his voice still rough from the fever's lingering effects. "This isn't payment. It's simply recognition. I have traveled across half of Greece in my years as a merchant, and I have never encountered a voice like yours. Whatever gift you carry, the world beyond these hills deserves to know of it." Thelxie thought little of his words at the time, assuming them simply the grateful exaggeration of a man recently spared from death's threshold. But merchants, by the nature of their trade, carry stories as readily as they carry goods, trading tailies alongside cloth and spices in every market town they pass through. And so, over the following months, without Thelxie's knowledge or intention, stories of the girl from Ono, whose voice could calm the dying, began to spread slowly outward from the hill country, carried by traders and travelers into towns and villages Thelxie herself had never even heard named. It was inevitable, perhaps, that such stories would eventually reach ears far more powerful than any village elders, though neither Thelxie nor Argyra could have anticipated exactly how, or when that attention would finally arrive, nor in what form it would ultimately take shape. For now, though, life in Ono continued much as it always had. The rhythms of planting and harvest, of illness and recovery, of quiet mornings spent at a hidden spring in careful, cherished conversation with an old and patient friend. Autumn arrived gently that year, a welcome contrast to the harshness of the previous winter, and the village's harvest proved abundant enough that Calira allowed herself, for the first time in longer than Thelxie could remember, genuine relaxation as the season turned. It was during this peaceful autumn that Thelxie turned 18, an age that in the customs of the hill country marked the beginning of a young woman's eligibility for marriage. And though Thelxie herself had given the matter little thought, absorbed as she was in her work and her friendship with Argyra, Calira began, with the practical concern any mother of that era carried, to consider her daughter's future more seriously. There was a young shepherd in the village, a kind and steady young man named Perseus, who had watched Thelxie with quiet admiration for several years. Though he had never worked up the courage to speak of it directly, aware of the strange reputation that clung to her, the whispered talk of unusual gifts and unexplained absences into the hills. Kalira, noticing his lingering glances during village gatherings, gently raised the subject with her daughter one autumn evening as they prepared the evening meal together. Perseus asked after you again today, Kalira said carefully, watching Thelxie's reaction as she spoke. He is a good young man, steady, kind to his animals, and to his aging mother. Many girls in this village would consider themselves fortunate to catch his interest. Thelxie, startled by the sudden shift in conversation, found herself uncertain how to respond. She had, in truth, given little serious thought to marriage, her attention so consistently divided between her mortal duties and her friendship with Argyra that the ordinary concerns of village girls her age had somehow passed her by almost entirely. I hadn't considered it, she admitted honestly. Perhaps it's time you did, Kalira said gently, though not unkindly. You are of an age now where such considerations matter, Thelxie. I will not force your hand in this. I have never believed in forcing daughters into marriages they do not want. But I would be failing my duty as your mother if I did not at least raise the question and ask you to think seriously about what kind of future you imagine for yourself. The question lingered with Thelxie in the days that followed, unsettling something in her that she had not expected. She found herself, for the first time, genuinely considering what an ordinary mortal life might look like for her. A husband, children eventually, a home of her own within the village, rather than the small house she still shared with her mother. The gradual settling into the same rhythms that had shaped every woman in Ono's history before her, and she found herself wondering, with a discomfort she had not anticipated, how such a life might fit alongside her friendship with Argyra, whether a husband would understand her early morning absences, whether children might one day inherit whatever strange gift she carried, and how she would explain to a family of her own a friendship that had shaped so much of who she had become. She raised the question with Argyra during her next visit to the spring, hesitant at first, unsure how the Naiad might receive news that Thelxie's mortal life might soon expand to include a husband, a family, responsibilities that would inevitably draw her attention further from the quiet hours they had shared together for so many years. Argyra, when Thelxie finally worked up the courage to share her mother's suggestion, responded with a gentleness that surprised her. You seem to be waiting for me to object, the Naiad observed, as though you expect me to be threatened by the thought of you building a mortal life alongside our friendship. Aren't you? Thelxie asked honestly. Creation warned that attachments like ours often draw mortals away from their own kind, that I might drift too far from ordinary life because of the time I've spent here with you. Perhaps that warning held some truth in it, Argyra admitted. But I think the answer to that risk was never to abandon our friendship entirely, only to remain mindful, as we have tried to be, that you belong fully to both worlds, not only to mine. If you find happiness with this young shepherd, if a mortal family brings you the kind of joy that complements rather than replaces what we share, I would never wish to stand between you and that happiness. You wouldn't feel abandoned, Thelxie asked quietly, voicing a fear she had not fully articulated even to herself until that moment. I have lived many centuries in patient solitude before you ever came to this spring as a small child, Argyra said. I have learned across all those years that love offered freely does not diminish simply because it must be shared among more than one recipient. If anything, I suspect a mortal life lived fully, marriage, children, the ordinary joys and griefs of a life among your own kind, would only deepen what you bring to our conversations here, rather than emptying you of what you currently offer me. Thelxie felt something ease in her chest at these words, a fear she had carried without fully realizing its weight, finally loosening its grip. Then, perhaps, I will consider Perseus's interest more seriously, she said, though I make no promises yet. I hardly know the young man beyond passing greetings at village gatherings. Whatever time you need, Argyra said warmly. There is no urgency in matters of the heart, mortal or otherwise, however much your mother's practical concerns might suggest otherwise. Over the following months, Thelxie did begin, cautiously, to know Perseus better, accepting his company during village festivals, walking together occasionally along the paths between their families' respective properties, discovering, gradually, that beneath his quiet shyness lay a genuine kindness and steadiness that she found herself drawn to more than she had initially expected. He asked no uncomfortable questions about her occasional absences into the hills, seeming to accept, with the same easy patience he brought to tending his flock, that Thelxie carried certain private habits he need not fully understand in order to care for her. By the following spring, nearly 2 years after Cration's initial warning had first disturbed the peace of her friendship with Argyra, Thelxie, and Perseus were formally betrothed, a match that brought genuine joy to both their families and considerable relief to Calira, who had worried, more than she ever admitted aloud, about her daughter's unusual path finding room for ordinary happiness alongside it. Thelxie continued her visits to the spring, even as wedding preparations consumed much of the village's attention that spring, though she found, as the wedding date approached, that her visits naturally grew somewhat less frequent, not from any diminishing of affection, but simply from the practical demands of a mortal life expanding to fill more of her hours. Argyra, true to her earlier promise, showed no resentment at this natural shift, offering instead genuine warmth and encouragement as Thelxie shared details of the wedding preparations during each visit. The particular pattern she had chosen to weave into her bridal garments, the small disputes and compromises involved in merging 2 families' traditions for the ceremony, the nerve nervous excitement that colored her final weeks as an unmarried woman. The wedding itself, held on a clear early summer morning beneath the same hills that had witnessed both Thelxie's mortal life and her divine friendship unfold across so many years, was a joyous affair, attended by the entire village and blessed, according to custom, with offerings poured out to the gods who watched over marriage and fertility. Thelxie, dressed in garments she had spent months weaving with her own careful hands, felt, as she stood beside Percy's, exchanging their vows before the assembled village, a rare and complete happiness, the sense of a life fully and rightly lived, mortal joys resting easily alongside the quieter, more secret joy of a friendship that had shaped her since childhood. She did not know, as she celebrated that happy summer day surrounded by family and friends, that her wedding had drawn attention from eyes far beyond the hill country, that the merchant's stories, carried across half of Greece over the preceding years, had finally reached ears powerful enough to act on what they heard, and that the quiet, careful life she and Argyra had built together, balanced so delicately between mortal duty and divine friendship, was about to be tested in a way neither of them had yet imagined. The summer that followed Thelxie's wedding proved to be one of the gentlest seasons the hill country had known in years, warm without being punishing, blessed with just enough rain to keep the fields green through the driest months, and the entire village of Ono, still glowing with the joy of a well-celebrated wedding, settled into a rhythm of contentment that seemed, for a time, entirely undisturbed by the wider world beyond their quiet hills. Thelxie adjusted to married life with an ease that surprised even her. Perseus proved himself, as Calira had promised, a steady and gentle husband, patient with her occasional distracted moods, undemanding of explanations. She did not offer freely, content simply to build a shared life together one ordinary day at a time. They moved into a small home not far from her mother's, close enough that Thelxie could still help with the village's sick and expecting mothers, far enough to establish, for the first time, a household truly her own. Her visits to the spring continued, though as she had anticipated, they grew somewhat rarer, woven now around the demands of a household to manage, a husband's needs to attend, and eventually, as the following spring arrived, the discovery that she was carrying her first child. She brought this news to Argyra during one of her now infrequent visits, kneeling at the water's edge on a mild morning in early spring, unable to keep the joy from her voice as she shared the news. "A child," Argyra repeated, and even through the simple medium of water and voice, Thelxie could hear the warmth in the Naiad's response. "I confess, Thelxie, I did not expect to feel such joy at the thought of a mortal child, one I will likely never meet properly, one who may grow to adulthood and old age within what feels, to me, like the span of a single season. And yet, I find myself genuinely delighted for you. You'll meet them," Thelxie said firmly. "I intend to bring my children here when they're old enough to understand, to introduce them to the friend who has meant so much to their mother across her whole life." Argyra was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was something more cautious in her tone. Are you certain that's wise? A mortal life entangled with the divine carries risk enough for one person. To pass that risk on to a child, even in something as simple as an introduction to an old friend, is a decision you should consider carefully. I have considered it, Thelxie said, and I have decided that I would rather my children grow up understanding that the world holds more wonder in it than what can be seen in ordinary daylight, than have them live entirely unaware of the friendship that shaped so much of who their mother became. I will teach them caution, the same caution you and Creation taught me, but I will not hide you from them entirely. Whatever reservations Argyra still carried about this plan, she did not press the matter further that morning, sensing, perhaps, the particular firmness in Thelxie's voice that suggested her mind was already settled on the matter. Instead, their conversation turned to gentler things. The names Thelxie and Perseus were considering, the small preparations already underway in their modest home, the particular kind of nervous excitement that comes with any first pregnancy, mortal or otherwise unfamiliar to the one experiencing it secondhand through a friend's account. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, and in early autumn, as the almond trees began once again to shed their leaves in preparation for winter, Thelxie gave birth to a healthy daughter, whom she and Perseus named Euterpes, meaning well-pleasing, a name chosen in gratitude for the ease with which the child had arrived into the world after a labor far gentler than Calira, attending as midwife to her own grandchild, had dared to hope for. It was several months later, once the depths of winter had passed, and the child had grown sturdy enough to be carried comfortably on short walks, that Thelxie finally brought her infant daughter to the spring, fulfilling the promise she had made during her pregnancy. She knelt carefully at the water's edge, adjusting the sleeping child in her arms, and called softly for Argyra, feeling a nervous anticipation she had not expected to feel introducing her oldest friend to her newest joy. Argyra's voice, when it came, carried a tenderness Thelxie had rarely heard from her before. She's beautiful, the Naiad said, though how precisely a spirit bound to water perceived a sleeping infant's features, Thelxie could not have said. I can feel her heartbeat through your own, steady and strong. She'll grow to be healthy, I think, and stubborn, much like her mother. Thelxie laughed softly, careful not to wake the child. I hope she inherits patience from her father rather than stubbornness from me, she said, though I suppose we'll see which traits win out as she grows. They sat together for a long while that morning, Argyra offering the same gentle observations she had once offered a much younger Thelxie, though now directed toward an infant too small yet to understand any of it. And something in the scene, a mortal mother introducing her child to an ancient friend beside quiet water, carried a completeness that neither of them fully articulated aloud, but which both seemed to feel deeply in the comfortable silence that eventually settled between their words. It was this very scene, this quiet morning introduction between mortal infant and immortal spirit, that finally drew the attention that Creation's warning years earlier had always suggested might eventually come. The Fates, who had marked the thread of Thelxie's life, as noticed that harsh winter years before, had continued watching in the patient, unhurried way that characterized all their observations, waiting to see how the thread would ultimately weave itself into the larger pattern of the world. And in this moment, a mortal life extending itself forward into a new generation, still bound closely to the divine friendship that had shaped its own beginning. They finally reached a judgment about what should be done. The visitation, when it came, arrived not with thunder or dramatic upheaval, but with the same quiet suddenness that characterized so much of the Fates' work. Thelxie, still kneeling at the spring's edge, with her sleeping daughter cradled against her chest, felt the air around her shift subtly, the light growing somehow both brighter and more diffuse, as though the ordinary morning had been momentarily replaced by something existing slightly outside the normal flow of time. 3 figures appeared at the spring's far edge, so quietly that Thelxie, startled, nearly rose to her feet before some instinct told her that sudden movement would be unwise. She recognized them immediately from the old stories her mother had told her as a child. 3 sisters ancient beyond any measure of years, each engaged in the eternal work that defined their existence. Clotho, the youngest in appearance though eldest in some accounts, spun a thread of shimmering silver from a distaff that seemed woven from starlight itself. Lachesis, beside her, measured lengths of thread with a rod marked in symbols Thelxie could not read, her expression unreadable, ancient, and patient. And Atropos, the eldest and most feared of the 3, held her shears loosely at her side, though even that casual grip carried an unmistakable weight of finality. Thelxie's heart pounded with a fear more complete than anything she had felt during Creation's warning years before. This was no cautious river god offering advice born of old wounds. This was the true source of the power that governed every mortal life's beginning, duration, and end, standing now at the edge of her most treasured secret place, having finally decided, after years of patient observation, that the thread of her life required their direct attention. "Do not be afraid," Lachesis said, her voice carrying a gentleness that Thelxie had not expected from beings so thoroughly associated in the old stories with unavoidable fate and inevitable ending. "We have not come to punish you, child, though I understand why our arrival might suggest otherwise." Argyra's presence in the water grew suddenly tense, a stillness settling over the spring's surface that Thelxie recognized as the Naiad's own fear, carefully controlled but unmistakable nonetheless. "You have watched us for years now," Argyra said, addressing the 3 sisters directly. "What judgment have you finally reached?" Clotho, still spinning her thread of silver light even as she spoke, answered first. "We have watched this thread since the winter we first marked it," she said. "We watched a mortal girl and a Naiad build a friendship founded on nothing but patient kindness. Watched that friendship survive the caution of an old river god, the practical demands of mortal marriage. And now, arrival of a new generation carried forward into the same gentle pattern. "What have you concluded?" Argyra asked, her voice tight with an anticipation that mirrored Thelxie's own racing heart. It was Atropos who finally answered, her voice carrying less warmth than her sister's, though no less ancient wisdom for its coolness. "We have concluded," she said, "that not every thread which grows entangled with the divine requires cutting or correction. We have watched countless mortals across countless centuries grow careless with divine attachment, hoarding what should be shared, demanding what was never owed to them, growing arrogant with borrowed power, until correction became not merely wise, but necessary for the preservation of the larger pattern. All threads must ultimately serve." She paused, and Thelxie found herself holding her breath, waiting for whatever judgment would follow. "You have done none of these things," Atropos continued. "You have taken nothing from your friendship with this Naiad beyond genuine comfort and companionship. You have used whatever gift your unusual bond granted you. This voice that soothes the suffering and calms the dying, not for personal gain, but in service to your own mortal community, asking nothing in return beyond the simple ability to continue caring for those who need you. And you, Naiad," she said, turning her attention now directly to the water where Argyra's presence remained tense and waiting. "You have offered friendship without possessiveness, comfort without demanding the mortal life beside you sacrifice its own natural course to remain devoted solely to you. You encouraged this mortal toward marriage rather than discouraging it out of jealous attachment. You have shown across these years precisely the kind of restraint and generosity that so many divine attachments to mortals lack entirely." Lachesis, measuring her rod once more against the shimmering thread her sister continued to spin, added her own observation. "We do not often find threads woven this carefully," she said. "Most attachments between mortal and divine grow tangled precisely because neither party exercises the patience and generosity you two have shown across all these years. It would be a poor use of our judgment to cut short or punish a thread that has caused no harm to the larger pattern and considerable good to those within your small corner of it." Thelxie, still hardly daring to believe what she was hearing, finally found the courage to speak directly to the three sisters. "Then you're not here to end our friendship," she said, "or to punish either of us for what Creation warned might draw your displeasure." "We are here," Clotho said, her voice carrying something almost like warmth, despite its ancient, otherworldly quality, "to offer a different kind of judgment than the one you and your Naiad friend have feared these past years. We have decided that your thread and hers, woven together as they have been, deserve not correction, but a kind of blessing rarely offered to attachments between mortal and divine." "Blessing?" Argyra asked, her voice still carrying disbelief, despite the growing hope evident in her tone. "We cannot make you immortal, child," Atropos said, addressing Thelxie directly, her tone gentler now than it had been at the conversation's start. "Mortality is not ours to grant or withhold from those born into it. That is a boundary even we do not cross lightly. Your thread will still reach its natural end, as all mortal threads eventually must. But we can offer this, she continued, and here, for the first time, something almost like the barest hint of a smile touched her ancient, weathered features. We can ensure that the friendship you have built with this Naiad, so carefully and so honestly across all these years, will not simply end with your mortal death, as such friendships typically must. We can weave a thread of continuance, allowing your memory, your particular gift for soothing suffering, to pass forward through your bloodline, carried by your daughter and her daughters after her, for as many generations as this Naiad's spring continues to flow. Each daughter born to your line, so long as she seeks out this particular spring and listens patiently as you once did, will carry some fragment of the gift you were given, and will find, waiting for her, the same patient friendship you have cherished across your own lifetime. Thelxie felt tears rise unexpectedly at these words, overwhelmed by a mercy she had not dared to hope for even in her most optimistic moments. You would grant that, she asked, after everything Creation warned us to fear. Creation's fear was not unfounded, Lachesis said. He has watched many threads unravel through careless divine attachment across his long existence, and his caution, however unwelcome it may have felt to you both, likely contributed to the careful restraint that ultimately earned you this judgment rather than a harsher one. Fear, properly heeded, often prevents the very outcomes it warns against. You would do well to thank him, rather than resent the warning that shaped your caution these past years. With that, the three sisters began to withdraw, their forms growing gradually less distinct as the strange, diffuse light that had accompanied their arrival began to fade back into the ordinary morning it had briefly interrupted. But before they disappeared entirely, Atropos paused, turning her attention one final time toward the sleeping infant still cradled against Thelxie's chest. Your daughter will inherit fragments of your gift, she said, though it will manifest differently in her than it did in you, shaped by her own particular nature rather than simply repeating her mother's exact path. Do not expect her voice to soothe precisely as yours does. Expect instead that she will find her own way of easing the suffering she encounters, in whatever form that gift eventually takes for her alone. And with those final words, the three sisters vanished entirely, the spring's ordinary morning light settling back fully into place, as though their visitation had never disturbed it at all, leaving Thelxie kneeling at the water's edge, her daughter still peacefully sleeping against her chest, tears now flowing freely down her face, though these were tears born entirely of relief and overwhelming gratitude rather than any remaining fear. Ajara, she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Did that truly happen? Did we truly receive their blessing rather than their punishment? This Naiad's voice, when it finally answered, carried an emotion Thelxie had never heard from her before across all their years of friendship. Something that, in a being so old and so measured, felt almost startlingly raw. It happened, Udra confirmed. I confess, Thelxie, I have lived many centuries without daring to hope for an outcome such as this. I prepared myself, across these recent years of careful watching and worried waiting, for the possibility that our friendship might eventually be ended by forces neither of us could resist. However carefully, we tried to honor the boundaries we understood. I did not dare hope that the fates themselves might instead choose to bless what we built, to extend it forward through generations, rather than simply tolerating it within the span of your single mortal life. Thelxie wiped away her tears, laughing now through the remaining emotion, a sound of genuine, unguarded joy. Then Yutapaz will know you too, she said, looking down at her sleeping daughter with fresh wonder. And her daughters after her, for as long as your spring continues to flow. Seems so, Udra said, and Thelxie could hear, even through the simple medium of water and voice, something that sounded remarkably like the Naiad smiling. Though I suspect Krutpun will find this outcome nearly as surprising as we did. Perhaps I should send word to him that his years of careful worry ultimately contributed to a blessing, rather than the tragedy he feared. What did indeed eventually reach the old river god of the judgment the fates had rendered. And though Krutpun's response, when Udra finally spoke with him some weeks later, remained characteristically cautious, even in the face of such welcome news, there was, beneath his continued caution, something that might genuinely have been called relief. I am glad to be wrong in this instance, he told her, though I would ask you both to remain as careful in the future as you were in these past years. Blessings once granted are not always permanent guarantees against future difficulty. Continue to honor the restraint that earned you this outcome, and perhaps you will continue to earn the fate's goodwill for generations yet to come. Love in Unna continued much as it always had in the years that followed, the ordinary rhythms of planting and harvest, of birth and illness and eventual death, marking the passage of time as they always had across the hill country's long history. Thelxie raised her daughter Yutapaz with the same patient care her own mother had once shown her, watching with quiet wonder as the girl grew, and as Atropos had predicted, developed a gift distinctly her own, rather than a simple repetition of her mother's particular talent. Where Thelxie's voice had always calmed through wordless song, Yutapaz, it turned out, possessed instead an unusual gift for storytelling, a talent for weaving narratives that seemed to ease the particular suffering that comes from feeling alone in one's grief or fear, helping those who heard her stories feel, even briefly, less isolated in whatever difficulty they carried. She would sit beside the dying, as her mother once had, but where Thelxie offered wordless melody, Yutapaz offered instead careful, gentle stories, tales that helped the frightened understand their own experience as part of something larger, something that countless others before them had also faced, and somehow found peace within. Thelxie brought her daughter to the spring for the first time when Yutapaz was old enough to understand. Roughly the same age Thelxie herself had been when she first began truly conversing with Udjara, rather than simply sensing her presence as a small, unexplained comfort. The introduction proved, in its own way, as tender and significant as Thelxie's own childhood beginning had once been. Yutapha's listening with wide-eyed wonder as her mother explained the friendship that had shaped so much of her own life. And Udjara, in turn, welcoming this new mortal generation with the same patient warmth she had once offered Thelxie across so many years. "You look like your mother did at your age," Udjara told the young girl during that first proper conversation, "though I sense already something distinctly your own beneath the resemblance. Tell me, little one, what troubles you most when you sit quietly and let your thoughts wander where they will." Yutapha's, still young enough to answer such questions with complete, unguarded honesty, considered the question seriously before responding. "I worry sometimes," she admitted, "that the people I care about will forget the things that made their lives meaningful once they're gone. I worry that stories get lost, the way leaves get lost in a river, carried away until no one remembers where they started." Udjara was quiet for a moment, clearly moved by this answer in a way that suggested it resonated with something deep in her own ancient nature. "That is a wise worry for someone so young to carry," she finally said. "Perhaps that worry is precisely the seed of whatever gift the fates have granted you. A talent for ensuring that stories, once told properly, are not so easily lost after all." Thelxie watched this exchange with quiet joy, understanding, as she observed her daughter finding her own particular connection with the ancient spirit who had shaped so much of her own life, that the blessing the fates had granted was proving true in every particular way they had promised, extending forward not as a simple repetition of the past, but as something living and evolving across each new generation that inherited it. Thelxie lived a long life by the standards of her time and place, watching Euterpe's grow into a woman respected throughout the hill country for her gift of comforting storytelling, watching her own grandchildren born and raised within the same careful traditions she had established, watching with the particular satisfaction available only to those who have lived long enough to see their choices bear fruit across multiple generations. Her granddaughter's granddaughter eventually kneel at the same spring's edge, continuing a tradition that had, by that point, spanned nearly a century of careful, patient friendship between mortal bloodline and ancient Naiad. When Thelxie's own thread finally reached its natural end, in the quiet stillness of old age rather than any sudden illness or tragedy, she asked, in her final days, to be carried once more to the spring's edge, wanting, as her strength faded, to say a proper farewell to the friend who had shaped nearly every meaningful chapter of her long, well-lived life. Perseus, himself grown old alongside her, carried her gently to the water's edge on a mild afternoon in early autumn, the same season, though she did not remark on it aloud, in which she had first brought her infant daughter to meet Argyra so many decades before. I don't have much strength left for long conversation, Thelxie said, her voice weaker now than the confident tones Argyra remembered from their years of friendship, though no less warm for its fatting strength. But I wanted to thank you properly before the end comes, for listening to a small, strange child who wandered here alone so many years ago, for teaching me that the world holds more wonder than most people ever bother to notice, for the blessing that will carry our friendship forward through my daughters, long after I'm gone. Argyra's voice, when it answered, carried an emotion that even centuries of careful, measured existence could not entirely disguise. It is I who should thank you, the Naiad said. You gave an old, lonely spirit something I had nearly forgotten how to hope for genuine friendship, offered without expectation, sustained through every difficulty life placed before us. I will carry the memory of these years, all of them, long after your own thread has completed its course, and I will welcome each new generation of your bloodline with the same gratitude I've felt toward you since that very first night you finally understood I was truly listening back. Thelxie smiled, tears mixing with the particular peace that comes to those who face their ending, having lived fully and without significant regret. Then I go gently, she said, knowing you'll still be here, listening, when my great-granddaughters come seeking the same comfort I once found in this water. She passed peacefully several days later, surrounded by her family, mourned properly by the entire village that had known her gentle, steady presence across her whole long life, and true to the blessing the fates had granted so many years before. Her gift, transformed and renewed with each new generation, continued to flow forward through her bloodline for generations to come, each daughter finding, when she sought it, the same patient friendship at the spring's edge that had first shaped an anxious, listening girl into a woman whose quiet gift for comfort had touched an entire hill country across the whole span of her mortal life. The spring itself, they say, still exists somewhere in the hill country north of the Gulf of Corinth, though its exact location has long since faded from any map or written record, remembered now only in the gentlest fragments of local legend. Half-forgotten stories mothers occasionally still tell their daughters on quiet evenings about a girl named Thelxinoe, whose patient listening once earned an old Naiad's trust, and whose gentle courage, sustained across a lifetime of careful choices, proved to even the ancient fates themselves that not every bond between the mortal and the divine must end in tragedy, that some, tended with enough patience and enough honesty, can become instead something rare and lasting. A quiet blessing woven gently into the larger pattern of the world, undisturbed, for as long as memory and water both continue to flow.